Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Dial Global Virtual Workshop. I'm Rebecca. I am one of 2 community engagement managers here at Dial Global, and I am really excited to be joined today by the amazing Ritu Kiran-Jackson. So I'll let Ritu introduce herself in just a second, but just to give you a little bit of background. So Ritu is founder and CEO of Aubilities, a HR and neurodiversity consultant with over 12 years of experience. She's also a writer, academic reviewer, and key speaker, sharing insights, raising awareness, and building acceptance of neurodiversity with a specialism in autism, having published numerous articles and academic papers on this topic. So today we're going to be looking into exploring autism in the workplace and seeing how we can be better allies for our colleagues, our employers, and also our friends. So just before I hand over, I'm just going to remind you that there is a chat section and there's also Q&A. So if you put your questions in there during the session, I'll make sure they get answered either throughout or at the end. So yeah, very warm welcome to you, Ritu, and over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I am thrilled to be here today, and hello to everyone who can attend. I'm just going to share my screen, so please just bear with me for one moment while I share. Perfect, great. So hello everyone, sorry about the technical difficulty there. So as Rebecca said, I'm Ritu Kiran-Jackson, founder of Aubilities, and absolutely thrilled to be here today. Now, the session is around understanding autism in the workplace, but before I kick off, I'd just like to give you all a little bit of background on myself. There we go. So I went to King's College London and University of Oxford as my educational background. After leaving university, I became a management consultant for Accenture, working for a variety of different clients, and then moved in-house and worked for, you can see a few names there, Rentokil Initial, GoDaddy, Virgin Media O2, etc. And during my experience, I at some point got married to my husband, Peter, which you can see there in photo 1. We had our first child, Kyan, you can see in photo 2. And when Kyan was aged 2, which you can see in photo 3 and 4 there, he was diagnosed with autism. So that was my personal story and driving factor, and I'll take you through a bit more about autism. So as a parent and a first-time parent, my first question was, what exactly is autism? I'd heard of the term, I didn't know much about it. So I'm going to whiz you through a very quick session of what it is. I'm sure many people on this call may already know. So autism, it is one of many groupings that come under neurodivergence. So there are many different categories that come under neurodivergence, and autism is a neurodiversity, one of many. The World Health Organization defined autism as difficulty with social interaction and communication and atypical patterns of behavior. They can also find difficulty with transitioning from one activity to another, focus on details, and unusual reaction to the senses such as touch or sight or sound or smell, etc. So that gave me a really good baseline, but clearly wasn't enough for me to understand autism. So as I started researching more and more, what I realized was everything I read, everyone I speak to, there's all this different terminology. And what is the correct terminology? How should we be referring to people who are on the spectrum? So I've put a few terms here. Now, some of these are absolutely fine to use. Some of these are kind of considered offensive. And there's some that are just down to preference. I won't go through each one because we won't have enough time today, but I wanted to just highlight some of the key phrases. So often you'll see or hear some people say autistic person and some people say person with autism. What is the difference, right? Well, person with autism refers to autism being part of that person's identity. So for example, they may have other conditions, other neurodivergence categories that is part of their identity, and autism may just be one of them. So it's a person-centric approach, right? It's a person-centric identity where I am a person and one of my conditions is autism. Autistic person, on the other hand, flips that the other way around. It's saying identity first. I have autism, I am autistic, and that is my identity. So that is autistic person. And actually, depending on who you're speaking to, people have different preferences. So you'll often read in academic writing, in journals, etc., they will refer to person first, so person with autism, or the academic term being autism spectrum disorder. But actually, if you speak to the autistic community, a lot of those members like to be referred to as autistic person. So it would be identity first. And it's just important, if you do come across anyone on the spectrum, you can just ask them what their preference is, because it is different person to person. couple of other terms I just want to speak around is one I've just mentioned, autism spectrum disorder. So this is the academic term that is in most medical journals, publications, etc. A lot of people don't like the word disorder, or more than like, they don't identify with it. And the reason for that is disorder suggests that it's not orderly, it's something wrong, it's a negative connotation. So actually you can find that some people, when they're writing articles or any type of representation around ASD, they're actually starting to refer to it as ASC, which is autism spectrum condition, because they find that's more inclusive. So just a quick highlight that actually if you're reading medical journals, you'll probably still see ASD, but if you're reading, say, for example, news articles or anything like that, you'll probably see ASC. There's nothing wrong with either term, but like I said, they just have a different audience and different preference. I myself, as you'll see when I go through this presentation, I interchange between these terminologies, but my most used terminology is probably on the spectrum because I feel that's the most inclusive and the least offensive. So that was a quick round around terminology. And as I started researching more and more into autism, what I realized is the spectrum is not linear, right? A lot of people think the autism spectrum is like a scale from mild to severe. It doesn't work that way. So if we start on the left, the first illustration, a person on the spectrum can have one or two traits, which are shown there with the kind of pink and yellow hexagons. A person on the spectrum can have multiple traits, so they can have more than one or two. There could be a variance on the severity of those traits, right? So some of those traits could be really, really prevalent in people, and others may not have the same or may not have the same type of severity of traits. And then if you combine that with personality, so the individual, and obviously we all know personality is driven by nature and nurture, then that leads to the saying, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. To summarize, we're saying, although autism is a general term, actually, when you've met a person with autism, you cannot generalize the way that autism presents to every single person with autism. And that's really, really important. So the more I start, again, researching into autism and understanding, okay, so we've got a baseline understanding from the World Health Organization. We understand more about the terminology, what to use, what not to use, how to use it. And we understand the spectrum is not linear, right? It can convey itself and portray itself differently across different people on the spectrum. But when we talk about traits, what are we talking about, right? What do traits actually mean? So here's a list of just some of the common traits. This isn't everything, but these are some of the ones that are common across people on the spectrum. So people on the spectrum typically process information differently. Process information differently to neurotypicals. Neurotypicals is basically a term referred to people who are not on the spectrum, right? They may have difficulty in social interactions and understanding social cues and norms. They can have high emotion or very low emotion for particular situations. They have a varying sense of abilities. They can have really deep focused interest on particular hobbies or activities. They're quite resistant to change, and they much prefer their routine and knowing what is coming and knowing the expected. They can under or overreact to the five senses. So things like touch, taste, smell, etc. can be triggers for them. And finally, mind. Essentially, they're wired differently, right? So the way in which their mind works, the way in which that they might sense the world is going to be different. And the key thing to note here also around mind is people on the spectrum tend to usually have more than one neuro condition. So they may have autism, but actually 70% may have another mental health condition, and 40% may have two or more. So really mind is a key part. And equally, people on the spectrum, there's something like are 4 times more likely to suffer from anxiety and twice more likely to suffer from depression, right? So they're just some of the common traits. And actually, when I think about my son, which I showed in the first slide there, I can see a lot of this in him, right? So then I started thinking about, okay, we know a bit more now about the traits. And when I look to support my son, is this autism, is it well known? Am I going to receive support in terms of funding or in terms of therapies? You know, what does it look like globally? And actually, autism, the global statistics are 1 in every 270 have diagnosed autism. And it is important for me to say diagnosed autism, because actually that figure is thought to be a lot higher, but due to underdiagnosis, it appears as 1 in 270. And that's taken from the World Health Organization. But actually, if you look at high income countries, so let's take the UK, for example, that ratio changes to 1 in 100. 1 in 100 have diagnosed autism across the UK. If we look at Australia, that becomes 1 in 70. If we look at the US, that's 1 in 54. So you can see a great difference between the global statistics and then high-income countries and how much more prevalent those ratios are. And why is that? Well, there's a few reasons why. First of all, a lot of the high-income countries have a better idea of how to identify autism now. Second of all, there's been an expansion of diagnostic criteria. So, for example, Asperger's was not considered as part of the autism spectrum disorder, but now it is, right? There's also improved awareness and improved reporting. So now that we know that there's more of this around, we're also starting to report on it a lot more, which means we're monitoring and reporting what the statistics look like. So there's been a lot of work done in these high-income countries, and obviously I am fortunate enough to live in a high-income country. I live in the UK. So as I start to understand, okay, this is, what can be considered a significant amount of people, there must be enough out there to support this group of individuals. And support can look like many different things, but ultimately for any parent who has a special needs child, support for them looks like, how do I make this child independent? So when it comes to me not being around anymore, they are self-sufficient and they are okay. And for many people, that comes down to what would give purpose and meaning and what do they need to be self-sufficient? So, i.e. a job, right? A job gives you finances, which can provide financial stability, which can also give meaning and purpose and make you feel okay in the living world. So I was like, okay, let's start looking up some of these jobs and let's look at the employment rate for people on the spectrum. And I tell you, that's where I was astonished. So the employment rate for those that are on the spectrum who are not in full-time paid employment in high-income countries is, for the UK, around 84%. In the US, around 85%, and in Canada, around 86%. And that's just a few, right? Despite the fact that over 70% are wanting to work. So I couldn't get my mind around this. I thought, how is it we've got such a high proportion not in full-time paid employment, yet we've got over 70% who want to work? What is going on here? Why is there such a big gap? So I started exploring the gap. So we've got over 80% in many high-income countries not in full-time paid employment, despite the fact 70% wanting to work. So I need to explore, okay, how do organizations view diversity? What is going on in the organizational makeup of how they're viewing diversity? But equally, what are the barriers faced by individuals on the spectrum? What is the autistic community saying, right? What's stopping them? What's prohibiting them from entering the workforce? So I had to answer those two questions and look to those two organizations and to the autistic community to have a better understanding around this. So let's take organizations for the first moment. So how organizations view diversity. So typically, I've put a nice colorful wheel here. Now, these characteristics on this wheel are the protected characteristics. So these are usually protected by law and legislation in many, many countries. And we have seen from a diversity perspective, actually a lot of organizations focus on gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, etc. And disabilities has always been there, right? It's always been on the list. However, when we start to think about disabilities on that list, we usually tend to think of disabilities as physical disabilities, right? And with all the research that's been done recently around diversity and having a diverse workforce and what that can mean for the organization, we know having a diverse workforce and having some of these different groupings of people and some people being across groupings, we know that an organization can benefit from a healthier work culture because you've got people coming from different backgrounds, different diversities, who are providing different perspectives. We know that can lead to better communication because those people who are coming from those different backgrounds have a different style of communication. So we need to be better, we need to be clearer, right? And then actually that can lead to a much more attractive employee value proposition because the more an organization can show that they are diverse, where these different groupings of people are heard and have a voice and have a seat at the table, the more attractive it will be for others outside of that organization to want to be part of that organization. So that's great. Organizations have done a huge amount in some of these areas. So what's missing, right? How is there still this gap? And actually, there's this gap because under disabilities, what we haven't tapped into as well as we could have is the untapped neurodiverse talent pool, right? So the neurodiverse includes, again, many different people from different categories. I'm focusing on autism, but it will include people with dyslexia, dyspraxia, etc., right? And what can this group of untapped talent pool here provide? What additional benefits? Well, actually, there's a competitive advantage, right? So they think laterally, they think differently, which means actually you're more likely to have innovative products or services. There is an organization in the US, it's a software company based in New York, and 75% of their workforce are people on the spectrum. Why? Because it gives them a competitive advantage against their competitors. What about cost savings? So an organization typically, on average, let's say in the US, will spend about $5,000 per person in the hiring and training of that person as a new recruit, right? And that person, depending on age, as well as other demographics and other characteristics, typically if they're under 35, will stay in the organization just under 3 years. And if they're over 35, usually about 4 years, which means that after 3 or 4 years, you end up having to hire for that particular role again. But actually, people who are neurodiverse in this untapped talent pool, they can join organizations, and it's been proven in case studies that the retention rates of these individuals is much higher. So leading organizations who have done a lot of work in this area and launched autism at work programs such as SAP, Microsoft, EY, JP Morgan Chase, etc., they have found, they've been going with these programs for 6, 7, 8 years, and they have found that their retention rates are over 90%. So again, there's a huge cost saving here for organizations. CSR, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I hope you don't mind me jumping in there, because it leads quite nicely to one of the questions that I've had via email, actually. So it's interesting that you mentioned about the fact that hidden disabilities are so untapped and not really noticed at the moment, which is really interesting, because actually we had our review last year and it was actually shocking, the results of the sort of disability representation in top leadership. Not only that, but also the fact that it's not actually spoken about in the leadership. So I think it was something like 35% of senior leaders don't actually have disability inclusion factored into their strategy, which is crazy to me. And I think that really just speaks to the fact that it needs to come from like the top as well, in order for people to feel comfortable in expressing the fact that they may be neurodivergent. So the question we've had is around terminology. So I know you mentioned earlier that there was many different terminologies around neurodiversity and also autism. So someone asked, can you suggest any further resources around terminology, and also terminology when collecting data, because we want to collect the data of our employees, but we're unsure where to start with the categories around disability and neurodiversity. So I just wanted to check whether that was anything that you might be able to expand on at all.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few things. There's absolutely a huge wealth of resources out there, and I'm happy to send some across, Rebecca, that perhaps you can divulge to the audience on this call. But a great way to think about it is some organizations who know they have neurodiverse people within their organizations have actually got those groups of folks together, especially if it's an organization-wide exercise, i.e. it's not across multiple organizations, but it's internally in one organization. So they have got those individuals together. So one may have autism, one may have dyspraxia, one may have dyslexia, whatever it may be. And they've pulled them together and they've used them as a working group to understand what is the correct terminology, how should we approach it, what would be offensive, what would not. And by having those people involved, kind of gives the organization a little bit of a sense check that they're doing the right thing in approaching the right terminology for the wider audience based on the input and feedback from the people who have some of these conditions.
Amazing. Yeah, I think it's just about talking, isn't it? Asking and making sure that you are including the very people that you're trying to represent. So yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
Really helpful.
And it isn't easy, right? I gave the example when we went on the terminology slide that there are preferences that are not right or wrong, they're just preferences. So it's not always the easiest thing to do. However, there are some terminologies that are right and wrong. So again, if it's talking to some subject matter experts within your organization, or even looking at wider field organizations out there that can come in and give you an approach, I think that can help too. But I can certainly send some things across after this call as well.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. So we talked about cost savings. The next is corporate social responsibility. So a lot of organizations want to be seen to be doing the right thing, right? And we see that in many different aspects, whether it's helping the environment, whether it's helping other charities or whatever it may be. So actually, this is a great point for tapping into this talent pool, because what you're actually doing is providing a person that otherwise would have difficulty in attending and acquiring a job, providing them with meaning and purpose for their life, which actually impacts society, right? So a lot of society are influenced by what organizations do, and organizations usually tend to make the first move, and that infiltrates within society. So that's one thing. It's unmeasured, but we know that there is an impact there. But the part that is measured is the value economically. And what I mean by that is we measure as a country our unemployment rates, for one example. We measure costs in welfare, another example, right? So where you can see that you'll be making a difference would be around the economic value as well, by tapping into this untapped resource. And then finally, as much as I hate to admit it, we live in a capitalist country where organizations need to create better value for their shareholders, right? So how do we do that? By tapping into people with neurodiversity as well, by benefiting from all those points there in the black and red. You are actually creating better value for your shareholders, because you're showing the world out there that, hey, we're an organization that listens, we're putting ourselves apart, we're focusing on neurodiversities and hidden disabilities. This is what we're doing. It's saving us money from these retention rates, as one example. It's impacting our economy, so it's a much bigger scale. And ultimately, we've got a more attractive EVP, and we're creating better value for our shareholders. So there is a huge, huge pool here for organizations to jump on board. And I'm not saying that organizations are doing nothing with hidden disabilities. I think we are just at the surface. We're just scratching the surface, and we're just getting there. I work with many organizations where they already have employees that are on the spectrum or have other neurodiversities within their organizations, yet they don't know who they are. And they don't know who they are because they've not created that environment or that culture where people feel okay to disclose their conditions, right? So there's still a lot of work. I'm not saying there's nothing done, but there's still a lot of work. So this is just one side of the picture of how organizations view diversity, but it didn't really give me a view of why there are still barriers, right? So organizations, yep, you've got work to do, but let's talk to the autistic community and find out what their barriers are and how they see. So on this slide here, I've put down some of the main barriers. It's not an exhaustive list, but it is some of the main things that come up again and again, right? And I'll just go through a few, and if anyone wants me to go through any particular one, then please let Rebecca know. But let's take the recruitment process, right? So the recruitment process is designed for neurotypicals, and what is it actually measuring? It's measuring your social ability and aptitude, right? How well you can come across, the eye contact, body language, and tone of language, and also what you say about yourself, how you hype up your experience or what you've achieved in your career to date. So a lot of people on the spectrum find all of those things very, very difficult. Some of them find communication difficult. Some of them find eye contact and tone of voice very difficult to judge, and not just from other people, but also of themselves, right? And some of them find it difficult to talk about themselves in a way that they come across as this brilliant, shining candidate, because actually they're quite humble, they're quite innocent, and they're quite to the point and direct. So sometimes some of these things can come across not as they are meant to come across in the recruitment process. And it's until we look at our recruitment processes and identify, well, how do we make this recruitment process more inclusive for the neurodiverse? Because it's not designed for them, essentially, right? So that's just one example of a barrier. I'll give a couple of more, right? So let's say sensory issues. I'll give you a great story here. So a manager who was hiring on the neurodiverse thought, okay, I'm hiring this individual. I'm going to give them this desk in this open plan office, and I'm going to give it to them next to the window, because everyone loves a window seat, right? With a nice view, all of that. And the person who was neurodiverse actually really, really struggled. Number one, it's an open plan office, which means the noise level and chit chat and other noises and sounds were a distraction. And number two, they actually had a sensitivity to light. So they hated the window, the desk at the window. They just didn't like being seated there. They would much rather be seated somewhere a lot further into the office. So that's just one example of where, as neurotypicals, we think we're doing the right thing. We think we're giving people what they want, but actually we might not be, right? We might be hindering them in ways that we can't see or recognize. And sometimes those people don't feel vocal enough to tell us that. So it's understanding what their neurodiversity is, understanding their traits, and understanding what's right for them. If I go back to that saying, when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. because one person might have that sensory issue of light, but that doesn't mean another person has the same issue, right? That's on the spectrum. And perhaps we can just touch on support. So actually support's quite vague. It can probably encompass all of the things on this slide, but in particular, when I mention support here, I am referring to digital inclusion and accessibility, right? So digital inclusion in terms of all the tools and equipment that we provide. You know, often, again, ties back to the recruitment process. We can ask someone who's being a new hire, oh, what laptop would you like? Would you like this Dell laptop? Or would you like this Mac laptop? What kind of equipment would you like? But we don't ask them at that point in time if they need any other reasonable adjustments. We allow them to join as a new hire like everyone else. We ask them the same questions like everyone else. And then we expect that person to be able to disclose if they want a reasonable adjustment, right? So really, it's about looking at, again, what levels of support can we offer? What equipment can we offer? When can we offer it? Are we inputting that equipment at the right period of time? Are we making them feel comfortable to disclose things at the right period of time? And equally, it's looking at accessibility, right, of the digital equipment, software, etc. Microsoft are doing a huge amount in this area, and they really want to make a lot of their products completely accessible. And that's something holistically the IT department of any organization should be looking at, to make sure, again, it ties into D&I and it ties into what we want to achieve as an organization when we measure our D&I impacts across the organization. So, sorry, Rebecca, I can see you're off mute.
Yeah. No, yeah, thank you. I was just going to pick up on the piece around recruitment processes, because it's interesting that you've mentioned that. We did actually have a virtual lounge session a few weeks ago with, I think it was 4 athlete leaders from the Special Olympics Great Britain, and they were talking about, again, it's really, really shocking stats that I think it's 94% of people with an ID, intellectual disability, are unemployed as well. So they were just saying how when they go to an interview, they don't know automatically what to do. So they turn up at the interview and they haven't had instructions on what happens next or where to go. It's just simple processes that need to be put in place. It's not often hard. It's just thinking about the fact that not everyone thinks the same. So they might need a little bit extra or different support. So yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that because I found it really interesting when we had that lounge last week.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And the more you think about it now, the more I think how barbaric it is that that's actually a recruitment process, right? I mean, if you asked us this 20 years ago, we're so used to it working this way, and that's the norm. And it is the norm now, but we're actually starting to question, what are we looking at when we're looking at the recruitment process? You know, there's a study recently that was done as well, where it was found that managers typically tend to hire people that are similar to themselves. Again, that's part of unconscious bias, right? They're not doing that intentionally, purposefully. It's something that happens. So again, it's trying to understand, well, how do we get away from this? Because actually, the more diverse we are, the more of a stronger team we can have by pulling in different strengths. So yeah, absolutely, really interesting. Thank you, Rebecca. So that's just some of the barriers, but again, I won't go through all of them due to time, but I'm happy to answer any questions on specific areas if anyone has any. But after looking at the barriers, I think the next thing that came to me was, all right, so when we look at this gap and we go back to, the plus 80% who are not in full-time paid employment versus the plus 70% who want to work, and if we look at why, so we've seen now in the organization, there are maybe some ways the organization views certain things, and they've maybe not tapped into this talented talent pool. And then we look at the autistic community and we can see the barriers from their perspective of entering the workforce. So, okay, we've understood both folds. So how do we overcome these barriers, right? How do we create a place where organizations can take an approach towards neurodiversity and the autistic people or anyone else with neurodiversities feel comfortable and feel, okay, that the barriers are being reduced to the point where they no longer exist? So here's a few examples of how we can do that. It comes under 4 categories to provide a holistic approach, and it is important for organizations to take holistic approaches. There is no point in focusing only on one of these areas. They need to be focused on together and worked on together. So again, I'll touch on just a few bullet points, but I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards if there's any particular points we want to cover. So the first is around people. So Rebecca, you mentioned earlier around leaders and leaders disclosing what they do. You're absolutely correct. Leaders are a key point in any organization. I think something like 12% of organizations report on disabilities, and only 5%, only 5 reporting it at a board level or have made issued statements from a board level. So again, that goes to show how much we can make some progress just in that one area, right? Then you've got managers and colleagues. For me, the key people are managers. They are your key people, right? Because if they can understand and foster a culture just within their own team of having a diverse workforce and what that means in terms of respect, what that means in terms of inclusivity, what that means in terms of applying the strengths, bringing out the brilliance, all that kind of stuff. They're your key points. Your key factors are managers. So that's one area, and we can work on leaders, managers, colleagues, mentors, job coaches in many different ways. To give you an example of what Aubilities, the company I've started up, what they do is we focus on digital content, because what we find is it's very easy to bring in a speaker who can do a session on neurodiversity and say, hey, this is what you need to look out for. But that's a one-off session. So all you've captured is a one-off session for these groups of individuals to give them some awareness and raise some knowledge, and but that doesn't actually make it consistent or repetitive across the organization. And so that might be one of the key factors that to overcome. Then we've got practices. So this is really looking in way more detail on what an organization does in terms of their processes, their practices, looking at their policies, and even really small things like breaks and change. So people who are neurodiverse, especially those on the spectrum, really sometimes needs some literal direction in terms of when to take a break. And if there's change coming up, they need a different approach of how to manage that change. So we all talk about change management, and usually that's a big component in any projects that we do, right? But we also need to factor in that if we have a group of individuals within the organization who are neurodiverse, how do we manage change for them? Because that is slightly different, right? The next is culture. So culture for me is taking a person-centric fit, right? Often we say to each other, if someone's going through the recruitment process, oh, I don't know if there'll be a cultural fit, right? Do we want them to be a cultural fit? Do we want our organization to have people who are just like each other? Maybe we do want people who think differently, who act differently, who behave differently, because actually doesn't that drive some of the diversities that we're hoping to achieve, right? And there's many other things we can do to foster a culture of inclusivity, and also to bring psychological safety to the neurodiverse, right? I've put a few things there in terms of examples, and again, happy to touch on any of those if anyone wants to know any specific information. And the other is equipment. So I already touched on this in our last slide, and I'll just go over it a little bit more. So we've got digital inclusivity and practical equipment that we've got to consider, and also not just what we offer, but when we offer it and how we offer it, right? But on top of that, it's all about visual environments. We often work in open plan offices, obviously when there isn't COVID-19, and in that office space, is often noisy. We should see whether we've got some quiet spaces to offer people with neurodiversities, and we should take a look at our general office approach. So do we have many posters scattered all over the office? Are they all colourful? Are they all clear in terms of language? These are the kind of things we need to consider when we're trying to appeal and be more inclusive for the neurodiverse. So there are just a few things around overcoming barriers. And if we can overcome those barriers, and if we can hire from this really talented individuals, then actually the benefits can be far-reaching, right? They go from a micro to macro level. So from an individual's perspective, it gives them meaning and purpose in life, right? From an organization's perspective, I already mentioned some of the benefits, i.e. a more attractive EVP, a more competitive advantage, better value for the shareholders. It impacts society. It's bringing down those unemployment rates, right? Which actually then impacts the economy overall, because it means that, let's take the UK, for example. The UK spend about 24 billion on welfare costs for people on the spectrum and people with disabilities. It will start bringing some of that down, because these people then are able to fund for themselves because they are in employment. So put simply, this is good business. Why wouldn't you do it, right? And I just want to close on the presentation side just by introducing Aubilities. So Aubilities, Making the Invisible Invisible, is a company that I've set up. We're a social enterprise, so we care a lot more about the cause and making a change and changing that dial, right? Moving the narrative, changing the dial, than we do about revenue as a typical organization. Our vision is to help organizations optimize their people by using neurodiversity to increase value, while providing the autistic community with meaningful employment, right? So helping organizations get the best of their people, including the neurodiverse, and helping the autistic community find that meaningful employment. And we deliver on our vision through our mission. So our mission is to raise awareness, but of course everyone knows it doesn't stop there. Raising awareness is not enough. We want to build acceptance. So this is helping organizations to make improvements and become more inclusive, and then to promote neurodiversity. And the way we do that is we identify the roles within the organization and plug in the neurodiverse into those roles to really achieve a differentiated workforce and increase value. So we deliver on our mission through our services. We offer training. We can do classroom training, but we really specialize in digital content. And again, why? Because it is consistent. You can make it repetitive. It is accessible 24/7 by any employee all over the world, which means that you don't miss out on a one-time session that only captures the managers of that time. We offer consulting. So this is to build awareness, to build acceptance. And we do this through improvements made within the organization. So again, this is looking at your policies, your processes, your practices, and understanding where we can make tweaks or changes that can make those much more inclusive for the neurodiverse. And then finally, resourcing. So this is promoting neurodiversity, again, finding the right positions or identifying the right roles where we can plug in the neurodiverse and really try to increase that value and offer a differentiated workforce for the organization. So ultimately, we offer services to bridge the gap between the offering and the utilization of the neurodiverse. We work with public sector, private sector, with training, consulting, resourcing, underpinned by subject matter experts, academics, and the autistic community themselves where appropriate. But together, we want to drive change. And that's it today for me. But Aubilities, please do follow us on LinkedIn or again, connect with me individually. I would love to hear from anyone on this call or do contact us through our email address or website.
Thanks so much, Ritu. That was incredible. Thank you for sharing. There are quite a few questions, both directly to me and some in the Q&A. So I'm just going to group a couple together. So we've got a few around the workplace and sort of intersectionality. So Catherine's said to me directly, so great presentation. Thank you, Ritu. I love the piece around the fact that not one size fits all. Do you have any tips for slightly smaller companies who might be unsure where to start on sort of accessibility? Because when you start to think about intersectionality, things can get quite complicated. So, sorry, I'm trying to read this here. So tips for smaller companies who are unsure where to start and may not have the resources to make all the amendments that you've mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. So Aubilities, one thing that we do that I would recommend, and it doesn't have to go through us, of course, although I would love it if you would like to. We have a diagnostic tool. And what this diagnostic tool is, you fill in a series of questions from different people within the organization, and it spits out a report of areas in which you're excelling as an organization versus areas where you can make some improvements. And something like that, because that doesn't depend on the size of your organization, that's just a blanket approach of understanding where your strengths are and where you're working towards D&I versus where you can make some improvements. Doing something like that, finding a subject matter expert or an organization that can do that for you, I think will really help you to understand the key areas. And once you've got that, you can then start to build a strategy which works for your organization. So if you're a small organization, you can build a strategy that may take, let's say, 2 years as opposed to 1 year, because you may not have the resources or the budget or yada, yada, yada. And you can start building the key components to work towards the end goal and the end target, which will be in that report. So we do this, Aubilities does this with many organizations as one of the service offerings. If you'd like to connect with me, I can talk you through that. But ultimately, I think the first step is understanding where are you at? Where's your baseline? Because only once you've got that baseline, you can understand where the improvements need to be made and make that strategy towards those improvements.
Amazing, thank you. Exactly. So you don't know where you're going unless you realize where you're currently at. So yeah, I love that. So there's a few here around diagnosis. So one person it's actually an anonymous attendee has said, how do you start the process of diagnosis as an adult? Is this something workplaces could or should support on? And then Ben in the comments has asked, what advice would you have for someone who has recently been diagnosed as neurodivergent, ADHD, as an adult in particular, when it comes to understanding what support they may need, as well as supporting their manager/team through that journey? Okay,
so 2 really good questions. I might have to ask you to repeat the second in a moment, but I'll try and focus on the first. So I think the first was around how do you get diagnosis as an adult? and should that go through a work scheme or something? So to answer the question, diagnosis as an adult goes through your GP or your doctor. You would go to your doctor, you would explain why you think you might be on the spectrum, or any other condition you think you may have. You'd have a chat, and they refer you to multiple different specialists and professionals who will do assessments. At the moment, the only way to have diagnosed autism is to go through this assessment where they measure different things, they ask different questions, and then they'll give you, yes, you've got a diagnosis of autism, or you don't. What they don't give you is a view of, if you remember at the beginning of this call, I mentioned you can have like mild or severe. They won't give you a view of that. Only you will know that, but they can give you a diagnosis of yes or no.
Perfect.
So I think that was first. And actually, to point on that, they also asked whether it should be related to a work scheme.
Yep.
So my personal opinion is that it should not. And the reason for that is, like anything else you may be diagnosed with, whether it be cancer or whether it be something, depression, whatever else, it is personal to the individual, right? And it's the individual's choice of whether they wish to disclose that to the organization. If there was an organizational work scheme and you go through the work scheme, there may be a need for the organization to then have a copy of those results so they can make all the right adjustments. So on one hand, yes, it can help an organization support those people who receive a diagnosis. But on the other hand, people who receive a diagnosis then lose the right to either disclose or not disclose their condition, right?
Mm-hmm. Great. Did you want me to repeat the next one?
Yes, please.
Yeah, no worries. So Ben's asked, what advice would you give for someone who has recently been diagnosed as neurodivergent, ADHD, as an adult, in particular when it comes to understanding what support they need, as well as supporting their manager and team through that journey?
Great, good question. So this is really common. A lot of people I speak to have a late diagnosis, and they have a diagnosis as an adult. It's very, very common. And what I would say is, you need to first understand your strengths and your areas where you struggle, right? And it's not an easy thing to do. Grab a pad of paper and a pen, write it down, figure out, okay, I find this stuff easy. Look inwards to yourself and say, I really do struggle with this stuff. I didn't realize before that this is now part of my condition, but I can see now that I've been diagnosed with this condition, these are the areas I struggle with. Your HR department within any organization should be able to provide reasonable adjustments that should help you with some of the parts you struggle in. Obviously, every organization is different in terms of what they can provide and the process in which they provide those items. There is also government incentives that the HR department can also lean on to get some of those things back in terms of funding, right? But HR can advise on that. If you feel comfortable to disclose to HR, then they can do something in terms of acquiring reasonable adjustments. If you're a manager and you're managing a team of folks and you've recently received this diagnosis, my advice is to share with them that you have this diagnosis and what this means for them, right? So have a really open conversation around, hey, I received this diagnosis, I'm trying to understand it myself, and I'm trying to receive the support from my organization myself. But I wanted to share so that if sometimes when we're having our one-to-ones or we're having reviews on performance or anything else, that it comes across that I'm like X, Y, or Z, it can be because I think this way, or I act this way, or this condition impacts me this way. So it is really important. I have a person who reports to me who is neurodiverse, and she only disclosed it very recently, actually. So I didn't know before that, but actually it's done a huge amount for our relationship because now I understand her better. So I understand, okay, she reacts like this because this condition impacts her in this way. So now I've changed my management style to interact with her in a different way that supports her better, right?
Yeah, completely. And I think that actually ties in quite nicely to John's question. So John's said to me, we've heard a lot more about workplaces, how they can support, but what about colleagues and people in general? So what everyday actions can we make to better support our neurodivergent team members or friends or colleagues?
That's an amazing question. It's one that's very close to my heart. And the reason I say that, can I just go back a few slides here. So when I mentioned about training and digital content, actually what we've created at Aubilities is a curriculum of different engaging animated videos exactly for neurotypical managers and neurotypical colleagues on what they can do to support the neurodiverse colleague they might be working with or the neurodiverse direct report they might be managing, right? And there's a whole host of tips and tricks. I won't have the time to mention all of them, but to give you a few flavors, if you're a manager managing, you have a direct report who's neurodiverse, it's really important that instructions are clear, they're simple. Sometimes they prefer help with color coding their calendar. So if there's a color coding app or something like that they can use, they would really like to know when they can take breaks, what hour their lunch is in. It's really about bite-sized, focused pieces of instruction, right? That's one example. If you're a colleague supporting someone who is neurodiverse as part of your team, then actually what's really helpful is some people who are neurodiverse struggle with the social part and social interaction. So actually it's great to get some one-on-one time with them to understand and make clear what they expect from you and what you expect from them, but give them those questions, the topics or the questions that you want to touch in that one-on-one beforehand, so they can really think what they want to say. Because again, not knowing or not expecting what the conversation is going to be around can be really can achieve a lot of anxiety from people who are neurodiverse. So they're just two small examples, but we've actually created a whole host of training around tips and tricks for managers and for colleagues. So perhaps I'm happy to demo these or show these to anyone who might be interested. They've got a lot more information than what I can go through today.
Perfect. Thanks, Ritu. I know we are just slightly over, but I think I'm going to just ask one more, if that's okay. So just a piece around families. So in the Q&A, we have a question. A beautiful family you have, Ritu. There's so much information out there, but I would like to hear from your words. How can we better support families with autism? So in terms of more of a family approach.
Amazing question. So I'm recently working with Virgin Media O2, and I'm sure they won't mind me saying this, but they've just done a whole segment on parents and carers. So they are not just looking at the neurodiverse, they're looking how that impacts other employees who are impacted by the neurodiverse. And if I do touch on my own personal story, I have to take my son to particular school meetings that other neurotypical children won't have. I have to attend quarterly meetings about his progress, which other parents won't have. I have to attend speech and language therapist sessions, which other parents won't have. I have to attend occupational therapy sessions, and I often need to figure out ways in which I can get him some more funding or do things to strengthen the areas where he needs more development. Now, parents who don't go through that, who don't have children with special needs, may not understand the time commitment and effort it takes for someone, for a parent or a carer of someone on the spectrum. So I think this question is vital, and we can all learn from the Virgin Medias of the world, where they are not only focusing on the neurodiverse population, but they have also targeted parents and carers, knowing that the impact is much more wider than just the population themselves.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Ritu. So I am just going to round up. So here's a couple of just the key points that I really, really loved. So I love the point around once you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So we shouldn't, we need to take the person-centered approach and not just assume, but listen and ask. And also just the fact of it's simply good business. So it shouldn't be a nice to have or an add-on. It needs to be in all aspects of the business from the top right through. So thank you so much. And I will, everyone who's watching, I will make sure you have the resources mentioned and also the website and Ritu's contact details in case you would like to find out any more. But for those watching on demand, this will be available inside the app. And as always, if you'd like to find out anything more about Dial Global that you don't know already, just get in touch with me or one of the team, or visit www.dialglobal.org.